Standing in my childhood bedroom 20 years later, I never expected to find the evidence that would destroy everything I believed about my family. The yellowed police report hidden behind my brother's dresser revealed a truth so devastating it made my stomach drop. My parents didn't just abandon me at 16 because they thought I was a bad influence on Marcus. They knew exactly who the real criminal was, and they chose to protect him by sacrificing me, the daughter they threw away like garbage to save their precious son's reputation. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this incredible story of family betrayal and ultimate justice, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. If you're ready for a wild ride filled with shocking twists and sweet revenge, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because this story will leave you speechless. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single detail of how karma finally caught up with my family 20 years later. My name is Serafina, and for 2 decades I carried the weight of being the family scapegoat. At 16, my life imploded when my twin brother Marcus was arrested for dealing drugs at our high school. Instead of supporting both their children through this crisis, my parents made a choice that would haunt me for 20 years. "This is all your fault, Serafina," my mother screamed that night, her face twisted with rage and disappointment. "You and your rebellious attitude influenced Marcus. He was a good boy until you started filling his head with your ideas about being independent and questioning authority." My father stood behind her arms, crossed, nodding in agreement. "We should have seen this coming. All those times you stayed out late, all those friends of yours with their piercings and attitude, Marcus was just trying to fit in with your crowd." I remember staring at them in complete disbelief. "Are you seriously blaming me for Marcus getting arrested? I had nothing to do with his choices. I didn't even know he was dealing." But they had already made up their minds. Within a week, they had packed my belongings and shipped me off to live with my Aunt Carolina in Portland, Oregon. Maybe some distance will help you reflect on your actions and how they affect the people around you, my mother said coldly as she loaded my suitcases into the car. The drive to Aunt Carolina's house was silent, except for the radio playing softly in the background. My parents didn't say goodbye properly, didn't hug me, didn't even look back as they drove away from the curb. I watched their car disappear around the corner, feeling like I was watching my entire world crumble. Aunt Carolina was nothing like my parents. She was warm, understanding, and actually listened when I tried to explain what had happened. "Honey, sometimes families make decisions based on fear rather than logic," she told me that first night as we sat in her cozy kitchen drinking hot chocolate. "It doesn't make it right, but it makes it human." Over the following months, I tried countless times to contact my parents and Marcus. My calls went unanswered, my letters returned unopened, and my emails bounced back as blocked. It was as if I had been completely erased from their lives. The pain was unbearable, but Aunt Carolina helped me channel it into something productive. I threw myself into my studies, determined to prove that I wasn't the failure they believed me to be. I graduated valedictorian, earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University, and eventually built a successful career in investigative journalism. Every achievement felt hollow because I had no family to share it with, but I pressed on creating a life for myself despite their abandonment. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to thrive after my departure. Through mutual acquaintances and social media stalking, I learned that he had gotten into a prestigious college, landed a high-paying job in finance, and married his college sweetheart. My parents doted on him, posting proud photos of his accomplishments while never once mentioning they had another child. For 20 years, I convinced myself that maybe they were right. Maybe I had been a bad influence. Maybe my rebellious streak and questioning of authority had somehow corrupted my twin brother. The guilt ate away at me, even as I built a successful life in Chicago, far from the family that had rejected me. Then Aunt Carolina passed away suddenly from a heart attack. She had been my anchor, my chosen family, and losing her felt like losing my parents all over again. When I flew to Portland to handle her affairs, I was surprised to discover that she had left me her house and a substantial inheritance. More importantly, she had left me a letter that would change everything. "My dearest Serafina," the letter began, "if you are reading this, I am gone, and it is time for you to know the truth about what really happened 20 years ago. Your parents made you believe you were responsible for Marcus's actions, but I have information that will show you just how wrong they were. In my safety deposit box at First National Bank, you will find documents that your father gave me years ago when he was struggling with guilt about their decision. He made me promise never to tell you while he was alive, but I cannot take this secret to my grave." My hands shook as I read those words. After the funeral, I went directly to the bank and opened the safety deposit box with the key Aunt Carolina had left me. Inside were photocopies of police reports, court documents, and most shocking of all, a confession letter written by Marcus himself. The police report revealed that Marcus hadn't been arrested for simple drug dealing. He had been running a sophisticated operation selling prescription medications stolen from our father's medical practice to students across 3 different high schools. He had been doing this for over a year using our father's medical credentials to obtain controlled substances and selling them at enormous profits. But the most devastating discovery was Marcus's handwritten confession never submitted to the court. In his own words, he detailed how he had manipulated our parents into blaming me for his criminal behavior. He wrote about how he had planted drug paraphernalia in my room, how he had convinced our parents that I was the one with connections to dealers, and how he had systematically destroyed my reputation to protect himself. "Serafina was always the stronger one," he wrote. "She questioned things, stood up for herself, and wouldn't just go along with what Mom and Dad wanted. I knew they would believe that someone with her personality was more likely to be involved in drugs than someone like me who always played the perfect son. I'm sorry for what I'm doing to her, but I can't go to prison. I have too much to lose." The final document was a letter from my father to Aunt Carolina, dated just 6 months after I had been sent away. In it, he admitted that they had discovered the truth about Marcus's operation, but decided to maintain the lie rather than admit they had wrongfully blamed me. He wrote about how they were afraid that bringing me back would expose their mistake and potentially damage Marcus's plea deal. "We have made a terrible mistake," my father wrote, "but it is too late to undo the damage. Marcus has agreed to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testimony against his suppliers. If we bring Serafina back now and admit we were wrong, it could jeopardize everything we have worked to rebuild. Carolina, please understand that we are not evil people, but we are trapped by our own poor decisions." Sitting in that bank, surrounded by the evidence of my family's betrayal, I felt a rage unlike anything I had ever experienced. They hadn't just abandoned me because they thought I was a bad influence. They had known I was innocent, and they had chosen to sacrifice me anyway to protect Marcus and preserve their own reputations. The drive back to Aunt Carolina's house passed in a blur of tears and fury. 20 years of guilt and self-doubt evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity that cut through me like a blade. I wasn't the family failure I had believed myself to be. I was the victim of a calculated sacrifice thrown away to protect my criminal brother and my parents' reputation. That night I sat at Aunt Carolina's kitchen table with all the documents spread before me, creating a timeline of events. The manipulation had been even more sophisticated than I initially realized. Marcus hadn't just planted evidence in my room. He had created an entire narrative about my supposed drug connections. According to his confession letter, he had stolen some of my personal belongings and left them at known drug houses around town. When police found my bracelet and school ID during raids, it corroborated his story about my involvement. He had also hacked into my social media accounts, sending messages to known dealers that made it appear I was seeking to purchase drugs. The most painful revelation was discovering that my parents had found additional evidence of Marcus's guilt just weeks after sending me away. A search of his computer revealed detailed records of his drug sales communications with suppliers and even plans to expand his operation to other schools. Rather than acknowledging their mistake and bringing me home, they had chosen to double down on the lie. My father's letters to Aunt Carolina revealed the true extent of their deception. They had actively worked to maintain the narrative that I was the problem child. When relatives and family friends asked about my absence, they told elaborate stories about my supposed drug problems and behavioral issues. They had poisoned my extended family against me, ensuring that even if I tried to return, I would face rejection from all sides. But the most enraging discovery was learning about Marcus's plea deal, because my parents had successfully convinced everyone that I was the true instigator. Marcus had been portrayed as a victim of my influence. His lawyers had argued that he was a good kid led astray by his troublemaking sister. This narrative had resulted in a dramatically reduced sentence and community service instead of prison time. As I read through the documents, a plan began forming in my mind. For 20 years, my family had lived with their lie, benefiting from the sacrifice of their daughter to protect their son. Marcus had built his entire adult life on the foundation of my destroyed reputation. My parents had maintained their standing in the community by painting themselves as victims of a difficult child rather than enablers of a criminal. It was time for the truth to finally surface. My first step was to contact Detective Raymond Kowalski, the original investigating officer on Marcus's case. Now retired, he was surprisingly willing to meet with me when I explained who I was and what I had discovered. We met at a small diner outside Portland, where I presented him with all the evidence Aunt Carolina had preserved. Detective Kowalski studied the documents with growing amazement. "I remember this case," he said, shaking his head. "Your brother's lawyers painted a picture of a troubled family situation with you as the primary negative influence. It was part of why his sentence was so lenient. If we had known about this confession letter and the evidence your parents were hiding, the outcome would have been very different." He explained that while the statute of limitations had passed on Marcus's original crimes, the evidence of evidence tampering and perjury during his trial proceedings could potentially still be prosecuted. More importantly, the revelation that his plea deal had been obtained through fraudulent means could have serious professional consequences for him in the financial industry. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish with this information?" Detective Kowalski asked me directly. I had been asking myself the same question. Part of me wanted revenge, pure and simple. I wanted to destroy Marcus's career and reputation the same way he had destroyed mine 20 years earlier. I wanted my parents to face consequences for their betrayal. But another part of me simply wanted acknowledgement, validation, that I had been wronged and deserved an apology. "I want them to face the truth about what they did," I told him. "I want the people in my hometown to know that I wasn't the family problem they were told I was, and I want Marcus to lose the privileged life he built on my sacrifice." Detective Kowalski nodded thoughtfully. "There are several ways we could approach this. We could take the evidence to the district attorney and see if they want to pursue any remaining charges. We could also contact the Financial Regulatory Board about Marcus's history of fraud, or we could take a more public approach." The public approach intrigued me the most. As an investigative journalist, I understood the power of media exposure. A well-researched article detailing the truth about my family's deception could reach far more people than any court proceeding. It would also be much more difficult for my family to control or minimize the damage. I spent the next several weeks conducting additional research. I tracked down former classmates, teachers, and law enforcement officials who had been involved in the original case. Many of them expressed shock and dismay when presented with the evidence of Marcus's manipulation. Several agreed to provide on-the-record statements about how the false narrative about my character had influenced their perceptions and decisions at the time. The most valuable interview was with Mrs. Henderson, my high school guidance counselor. She remembered me as a bright, questioning student who sometimes clashed with authority, but had never shown any signs of drug involvement. "I was always puzzled by the way your parents described you after Marcus's arrest," she admitted. "It didn't match the student I knew at all. You were rebellious in an intellectual way, not a destructive way." Armed with this additional testimony and the original documents, I began crafting my story. But I knew that simply publishing an article wouldn't be enough. I needed to ensure that the revelation would reach the people who mattered most, my hometown community, Marcus's professional network, and anyone else who had been told lies about my character. I decided to take a multi-pronged approach. First, I would write a comprehensive article for a major publication detailing the full scope of the deception and its consequences. Second, I would create a detailed social media campaign sharing key pieces of evidence and testimony to ensure maximum visibility. Finally, I would send copies of all the evidence directly to Marcus's employer professional licensing boards and anyone else who should know about his history of fraud and manipulation. But before I launched my campaign for justice, I decided to give my family one final opportunity to do the right thing on their own. I crafted a letter to my parents and Marcus, enclosing copies of all the evidence and giving them 30 days to publicly acknowledge the truth and issue formal apologies for their deception. After 20 years of living with your lies, I wrote, I am giving you one chance to tell the truth voluntarily. If you do not take this opportunity, I will ensure that everyone who needs to know the truth receives it directly from me. I mailed the letters on a Friday afternoon and then waited. For the first time in 20 years, I held all the power in our family dynamic, and they were about to discover just how much damage their betrayal had caused. The silence from my family was deafening. 30 days came and went without a single response to my letter. No phone calls, no emails, no acknowledgement that they had even received the evidence of their decades-long deception. Their complete dismissal of my ultimatum told me everything I needed to know about their character and confirmed that they had no intention of voluntarily doing the right thing. On day 31, I launched my campaign. My article titled, "The Daughter They Threw Away: How My Family Destroyed My Life to Save My Criminal Brother," was published in a major online magazine that specialized in investigative journalism and human interest stories. Within hours of publication, it was being shared across social media platforms and generating intense discussion in the comment sections. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people reached out to share their own stories of family betrayal and scapegoating. Many expressed outrage at my parents' actions and admiration for my resilience in building a successful life despite their abandonment. But more importantly, people from my hometown began to reach out with their own memories and observations. Jennifer Martinez, who had been in my graduating class, commented, "I always wondered what happened to Serafina. The stories her parents told about drug problems never made sense because she was always so focused on her studies and future plans. This explains everything." My former English teacher, Mr. Davidson, sent a private message. "I am horrified to learn the truth about what your family did to you. You were one of my most promising students, and I never believed the rumors about your supposed problems. I would be happy to provide a reference or testimony about your true character if it would help." But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Rachel Summers, who had been Marcus's girlfriend during his senior year, reached out with information that added another devastating layer to the story. "I need to tell you something that I never told anyone at the time," Rachel wrote in her email. "Marcus confessed everything to me right before his arrest. He told me about the drug dealing, about framing you, about convincing your parents you were the problem. He made me promise not to tell anyone because he said it would ruin his chances of getting into college. I was 17 and scared, so I kept his secret. I have felt guilty about it every day for 20 years. Rachel agreed to provide a sworn statement detailing Marcus's confession to her. This new evidence was crucial because it established that Marcus had premeditated the plan to frame me rather than simply allowing his parents to draw incorrect conclusions about my involvement. With Rachel's testimony in hand, I contacted Marcus's employer, Wellington Financial Group, one of the most prestigious investment firms in Chicago. I sent a detailed report to their compliance department outlining Marcus's history of fraud evidence tampering and criminal manipulation. The financial industry takes integrity violations extremely seriously, especially when they involve deceptive behavior that could indicate a pattern of professional misconduct. The response was swift. Within a week of receiving my report, Wellington Financial Group launched an internal investigation into Marcus's background and professional conduct. They also placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of their review. Meanwhile, my social media campaign was gaining momentum. I had created detailed posts on every platform sharing key pieces of evidence and testimony while maintaining a professional, factual tone. The hashtag #FamilyBetrayal began trending locally with people sharing their own stories and expressing support for my quest for justice. The attention wasn't entirely positive. Some people accused me of being vindictive and suggested that I should have privately resolved the matter with my family rather than making it public. A few of Marcus's friends and colleagues attempted to defend him, claiming that his teenage mistakes shouldn't define his adult life. But for every critic, there were 10 supporters who understood that this wasn't about teenage mistakes. It was about a deliberate, calculated betrayal that had destroyed an innocent person's life and family relationships. The evidence was clear and undeniable, and most reasonable people could see that justice had never been served. The pressure on my family intensified when the story was picked up by local news outlets in my hometown. Television crews gathered outside my childhood home, seeking comments from my parents about the allegations. Neighbors who had known our family for decades were interviewed about their memories of the situation and their reactions to learning the truth. Mrs. Patterson, our former next-door neighbor, told reporters, "I always thought it was strange how quickly the family seemed to erase Serafina from their lives. You don't just abandon a child unless something truly terrible has happened, but she had always seemed like such a good kid to me." The media attention forced my family out of their comfortable silence. My father finally broke and agreed to a brief statement to the local news. "This is a private family matter that has been misrepresented and taken out of context. We love both our children and made the decisions we felt were best at the time." His weak generic response only intensified public scrutiny. People wanted answers, not corporate-style non-statements. The fact that he couldn't directly address the evidence or offer any substantive defense of their actions made them look even more guilty in the court of public opinion. Marcus attempted damage control through his own social media channels, posting a lengthy statement that tried to minimize his teenage criminal activity while avoiding any direct acknowledgement of how he had framed me. "Like many teenagers, I made some poor choices in high school that I deeply regret," his post read. "I have spent the last 20 years working to become a better person and contribute positively to my community. The recent allegations against my family are a one-sided presentation of complex family dynamics that occurred over 2 decades ago." His carefully worded statement fooled no one. The evidence was too clear and too well documented for anyone to believe his attempts at minimization and deflection. More importantly, his statement completely failed to address the most damning aspects of the case. The evidence planting the manipulated narrative and his confession letter, detailing the premeditated nature of his frame-up. The investigation at Wellington Financial Group moved quickly once they reviewed all the evidence. Corporate policies required employees to disclose any criminal history or integrity issues that could impact their professional responsibilities. Marcus had failed to disclose his teenage arrest and conviction, and the revelation that his plea deal had been obtained through fraudulent means raised serious questions about his character and trustworthiness. Within 3 weeks of my initial contact with the firm, Marcus was terminated for violating company integrity policies and failing to disclose material information during the hiring process. The financial industry is remarkably small and interconnected, and news of his termination for integrity violations would make it virtually impossible for him to find similar employment elsewhere. But the professional consequences were only the beginning. The state medical board launched an investigation into my father's role in the prescription drug theft that had fueled Marcus's dealing operation. Although the statute of limitations prevented criminal prosecution, the medical board had broader authority to investigate professional misconduct and could potentially suspend or revoke his medical license. My mother, who had worked as a school administrator, faced her own professional challenges when parents in the district began questioning her judgment and integrity based on her role in the family cover-up. Several parents demanded that someone who could abandon their own child to protect a criminal shouldn't be trusted with authority over other people's children. The mounting pressure was clearly taking its toll on my family. According to neighbors who spoke to reporters, my parents rarely left their house anymore and had stopped attending social functions in their community. The comfortable life they had built on the foundation of my sacrifice was crumbling around them. Friends and extended family members who had believed their lies for 20 years began reaching out to me with apologies and support. My cousin David sent a heartfelt message. "I am so sorry that we believed the stories about you all these years. I should have questioned why someone with your character would suddenly become involved with drugs. Please know that you have family who support you and want to rebuild relationships." As the truth spread and the consequences mounted, I realized that my campaign had achieved something far more important than simple revenge. It had exposed a pattern of family dysfunction and manipulation that needed to be brought to light not just for my own healing, but to prevent my family from continuing their destructive behaviors with other people in their lives. The real test would come when they finally realized that their comfortable world of lies could no longer be maintained. How they chose to respond would determine whether any possibility of reconciliation could ever exist. 3 months into my campaign for justice, the carefully constructed facade my family had maintained for 20 years began to collapse spectacularly. What started as exposure of their betrayal had triggered investigations that revealed an even deeper pattern of corruption and manipulation. The state medical board's investigation into my father's practice uncovered evidence that the prescription drug theft had been far more extensive than anyone realized. Marcus hadn't just stolen medications for his teenage dealing operation. He had continued accessing my father's prescription pads and medical credentials throughout college and into his early career selling controlled substances to wealthy clients in Chicago's financial district. Dr. Elizabeth Manning, the lead investigator for the medical board, contacted me directly when they discovered the scope of the ongoing criminal enterprise. "Your initial report opened a door to something much larger," she explained during our phone conversation. "We have evidence that your brother has been using your father's medical credentials to obtain and distribute controlled substances for over a decade. Your father either knew and allowed it to continue or was criminally negligent in securing his practice." The revelation that Marcus's criminal activity had never actually stopped was devastating. While I had been building my life and career believing that his teenage mistakes were behind him, he had been operating a sophisticated drug distribution network that relied on my father's medical practice. The profits had funded his lifestyle, his career advancement, and even his wedding to his unsuspecting wife. Financial records obtained through the investigation revealed that Marcus had been depositing large amounts of unexplained cash into offshore accounts for years. His official salary at Wellington Financial Group could never have supported the expensive cars, luxury vacations, and high-end real estate investments that characterized his lifestyle. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators traced the supply chain of Marcus's operation. He hadn't been working alone. My father had been actively participating in the scheme, deliberately overprescribing medications to create surplus inventory that Marcus could divert for illegal sales. Patient records showed a pattern of suspicious prescriptions that had no legitimate medical justification. When federal agents raided my childhood home and my father's medical practice simultaneously, they found evidence that painted a picture of a family criminal enterprise that had been operating for over 2 decades. Hidden in my father's home office were detailed records of drug transactions, client lists, and financial statements showing how profits were laundered through various family accounts. My mother's role in the operation was perhaps the most heartbreaking revelation of all. She had been managing the financial aspects of the criminal enterprise, using her position as a school administrator to launder money through fake educational consulting contracts and fabricated expense reports. The woman who had abandoned me for supposedly corrupting her son had actually been the financial mastermind behind a multi-million-dollar drug operation. The arrests came on a Tuesday morning in November. I was in my Chicago office when Detective Kowalski called to inform me that all 3 members of my family had been taken into custody on federal charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, prescription fraud, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. "I thought you should hear this from me before it hits the news," he said gently. "The scope of what they were doing goes far beyond anything we discovered in your original case. Your decision to expose the truth about what happened to you 20 years ago has helped bring down a major drug operation that was destroying lives across multiple states." The media coverage of their arrests was extensive and brutal. The story had everything that captured public attention: family betrayal, medical corruption, financial crime, and a daughter's quest for justice that had unexpectedly exposed a massive criminal conspiracy. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and my phone rang constantly with interview requests. Marcus's wife filed for divorce within days of his arrest, taking their 2 children and moving back to her parents' home in California. In her statement to the press, she expressed horror at learning about her husband's double life and gratitude that the truth had finally emerged. "I had no idea about any of this criminal activity," she said. "I am cooperating fully with federal investigators and focusing on protecting my children from the consequences of their father's choices." The revelation of my family's criminal enterprise prompted dozens of Marcus's former clients and associates to come forward with additional information. Some admitted to purchasing drugs from him over the years, while others described suspicious behavior they had noticed but never reported. The evidence against my family became overwhelming as more witnesses emerged. Wellington Financial Group released a statement distancing themselves from Marcus and announcing a comprehensive review of their hiring and background check procedures. "We are horrified to learn that an employee used our firm as cover for criminal activities," their spokesperson announced. "We are cooperating fully with federal investigators and implementing additional safeguards to prevent similar situations in the future." The medical board moved quickly to revoke my father's license and initiated proceedings to bar him from ever practicing medicine again. The school district where my mother worked placed her on immediate administrative leave and began their own investigation into the financial irregularities in her department that federal agents had uncovered. As the legal proceedings unfolded, more details emerged about how my family had used my banishment to facilitate their criminal activities. With me out of the picture and unable to witness their behavior, they had been free to operate their drug empire without fear of discovery by someone who might question their activities or report them to authorities. My absence had also provided them with a convenient explanation for any suspicious behavior. When neighbors noticed unusual traffic at their house or questioned their sudden wealth, they could always blame it on dealing with Serafina's problems or trying to fix the damage she caused, and my reputation as the family troublemaker had been the perfect cover for their actual criminal behavior. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. They had destroyed my life and reputation to protect Marcus from the consequences of his drug dealing, only to enable him to continue and expand his criminal activities for decades. Their betrayal of me had directly facilitated the growth of the very criminal enterprise that was now destroying them. Federal prosecutors offered me the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement during the sentencing proceedings. For months, I had been focused on exposing the truth and seeking justice, but the prospect of actually confronting my family in court forced me to consider what I really wanted to say to the people who had caused me so much pain. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early December. As I prepared to face my family in court for the first time in 20 years, I reflected on how dramatically our roles had reversed. They were now the ones facing judgment and consequences, while I was the credible witness whose testimony would help determine their fate. The scared, abandoned 16-year-old girl they had thrown away had grown into a successful, respected professional whose investigation had brought their criminal empire crashing down. The justice I had sought for myself had evolved into something much larger: accountability for decades of criminal behavior that had harmed countless victims. As I walked into the federal courthouse that December morning, I knew that this confrontation would finally close the chapter on 20 years of pain and open the door to whatever came next in my journey toward healing and redemption. The federal courthouse was packed with reporters, victims, and curious onlookers when I walked in for the preliminary hearing. 20 years after being banished from my family, I was returning as the key witness whose testimony would help determine their fate. The reversal of power was both satisfying and surreal. My family sat at the defendant's table in orange jumpsuits, looking nothing like the respectable middle-class professionals they had pretended to be for decades. Marcus, once confident and privileged, appeared haggard and defeated. My father stared at his hands, unable to make eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. My mother, the woman who had called me a bad influence while secretly running a criminal empire, sat rigidly upright but with tears streaming down her face. When I took the stand to provide my victim impact statement, the courtroom fell completely silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for: the abandoned daughter confronting the family who had betrayed her. "Your Honor." I began, my voice steady despite the emotion churning inside me. 20 years ago, my family made a choice to sacrifice me to protect their criminal son. They told everyone I was a drug-addled troublemaker who had corrupted my innocent brother. They abandoned me, erased me from their lives, and poisoned my extended family and community against me. I looked directly at my parents as I continued. What I didn't know then was that their betrayal was just the beginning. While I was building a life from nothing, believing I deserved their rejection, they were using my absence to expand their criminal activities. They turned my brother's teenage drug dealing into a multi-million-dollar operation that destroyed countless lives across multiple states. The prosecutor had provided me with victim statements from people who had suffered because of my family's drug operation. Stories of addiction overdoses and families destroyed by the controlled substances my family had illegally distributed. Their criminal enterprise had real victims beyond just me, and those stories deserved to be heard. The drugs my family sold led to the overdose death of Sarah Mitchell, a college student who bought prescription opioids from my brother during her finals week. The addiction medications they diverted from legitimate patients caused Maria Rodriguez to suffer through withdrawal when her actual prescription wasn't available. The stimulants they sold to financial industry professionals contributed to the cardiac arrest that nearly killed James Thompson at age 28. The weight of those stories hung heavy in the courtroom. This wasn't just about family dysfunction or personal betrayal anymore. This was about a criminal conspiracy that had caused measurable harm to innocent people for over 2 decades. Marcus's lawyer attempted to argue that his client had been a teenager when the operation began and had simply continued down a path established by others. But the evidence clearly showed that Marcus had been the driving force behind the expansion of their criminal activities throughout his adult life. The financial records' witness testimony and physical evidence painted a picture of a calculating criminal who had used his family connections to build a drug empire. My father's attorney tried to claim that he had been manipulated and coerced by his son, but medical board investigators had found evidence that he had been actively recruiting other physicians to participate in the prescription fraud scheme. His medical knowledge and professional credentials had been essential to the operation's success and growth. My mother's defense was perhaps the most pathetic of all. Her lawyer argued that she had been a devoted wife and mother who had simply been trying to support her family, but federal investigators had uncovered evidence that she had been the operation's financial strategist, developing sophisticated money laundering techniques and recruiting school district employees to help wash drug proceeds through fraudulent contracts. The federal prosecutor painted a comprehensive picture of a family criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for decades because they had successfully convinced their community that they were respectable professionals dealing with a troubled daughter. My banishment had provided them with perfect cover for their criminal activities. When it came time for my family to speak, their statements revealed the depth of their continued self-deception and inability to take responsibility for their actions. Marcus stood and delivered a prepared statement that attempted to minimize his role while shifting blame to unnamed associates and difficult circumstances. "I made mistakes that I deeply regret," he said, "but I never intended for things to go as far as they did. I was young when this started, and I got in too deep to find a way out." His refusal to acknowledge the deliberate nature of his actions or express any remorse for framing me 20 years earlier confirmed that he had learned nothing from being caught. He was still the same manipulative person who had destroyed my life to save himself. My father's statement was even more disappointing. He spent most of his time talking about the stress of dealing with a difficult family situation and the pressure he felt to provide financial support for everyone. He never directly acknowledged his criminal activities or expressed genuine remorse for his actions. "We love both our children," he said, finally looking in my direction, "and we did what we thought was best for everyone involved given the circumstances we were facing." His words felt like a slap in the face. Even now, facing federal prison, he couldn't bring himself to admit that throwing me away had been wrong or that their criminal activities had been a choice rather than a response to circumstances. My mother's statement was the most painful to hear. She spoke about being a devoted mother who had tried to hold her family together during difficult times. She talked about the stress of dealing with children who were going down different paths and the impossible choices parents sometimes have to make. She never once used my name. She never acknowledged that I had been innocent of the charges they had allowed me to bear. She never expressed remorse for the 20 years of pain and isolation her betrayal had caused. Even facing the consequences of her crimes, she couldn't admit that I had deserved better from the people who were supposed to love and protect me. The judge listened to all the statements and evidence before delivering his own remarks. "This case represents a profound betrayal of trust on multiple levels," he said. "These defendants violated their professional obligations, exploited their community standing, and destroyed family relationships to facilitate criminal activities that caused immeasurable harm." He specifically addressed their treatment of me. The defendants' decision to scapegoat their innocent daughter to protect their criminal son represents a level of family dysfunction that enabled decades of continued criminal behavior. Their actions not only destroyed Miss Serafina's relationship with her family, but provided cover for criminal activities that harmed countless victims. The sentences were substantial. Marcus received 12 years in federal prison for his role as the operations leader. My father received 10 years and permanent loss of his medical license. My mother received 8 years for money laundering and financial crimes. As I watched them being led away in shackles, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice finally served, but also sadness for what our family could have been if they had made different choices 20 years ago. The scared 16-year-old girl they had abandoned had grown into a woman strong enough to bring down their criminal empire. Their betrayal had created the very person who would ultimately destroy them, and there was a poetic justice in that outcome that felt almost too perfect to be real. 6 months after my family's sentencing, I found myself standing in the same bedroom where I had discovered the evidence that changed everything. The house had been seized by federal authorities as part of asset forfeiture proceedings, and I was there as a witness to ensure that any remaining evidence was properly cataloged and preserved. The room looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the personal belongings that had once made it feel like home. But as I stood there, I realized that this space no longer held any power over me. The scared, guilty teenager who had once lived here was gone, replaced by a woman who had not only survived their betrayal, but had used it to bring justice to countless victims. The impact of my investigation extended far beyond my family's convictions. The federal task force that had taken over the case used the evidence I provided to uncover a network of corrupt medical professionals and financial industry conspirators who had been facilitating prescription drug trafficking across multiple states. My decision to expose one family's lies had helped dismantle a criminal enterprise that had been operating for decades. Detective Kowalski called me regularly with updates on the continuing investigation. "You opened a door that law enforcement had been looking for years," he told me during one of our conversations. "The evidence you preserved and the investigation you started has led to over 30 additional arrests and the seizure of millions of dollars in criminal proceeds." The personal vindication was equally profound. The community that had once believed my parents' lies about my character now understood the truth about what had really happened 20 years earlier. Local newspapers published follow-up articles detailing the extent of my family's deception and the injustice of my treatment as a teenager. Mrs. Henderson, my former guidance counselor, organized a community meeting where dozens of people who had known me in high school came forward to apologize for believing the false narrative my family had created. "We should have questioned their story more carefully," she said during the gathering. "You deserved better from all of us." The financial restitution from my family's criminal enterprise provided resources I never expected to have. The federal court ordered that a portion of their seized assets be used to compensate victims of their drug operation, but there was also recognition that I had been a victim of their criminal conspiracy in a different way. The settlement I received wasn't just money, it was acknowledgement that their betrayal of me had been part of their criminal activities. But the most meaningful changes in my life had nothing to do with money or legal vindication. The process of exposing the truth about my family had connected me with people who truly understood the pain of family betrayal and the strength required to overcome it. Rachel Summers. Marcus's former girlfriend, who had provided crucial testimony about his confession, became one of my closest friends. Her guilt about keeping his secrets for 20 years had motivated her to become an advocate for victims of family abuse and manipulation. Together, we started a support group for people who had been scapegoated or abandoned by their families. "What happened to you wasn't just family drama," Rachel told me during one of our conversations. "It was systematic abuse designed to protect criminal behavior. Recognizing that difference is crucial for healing." The support group grew rapidly as word spread about our meetings. We discovered that family scapegoating was far more common than most people realized, and that many victims struggled with guilt and self-doubt even when they intellectually understood that they had been wronged. Jennifer Martinez, my former classmate, who had reached out during the initial media coverage, joined our group and eventually became a co-facilitator. Her own experience with family dysfunction and gaslighting had given her insights that helped other members process their experiences. "The thing about family betrayal," Jennifer observed during one of our sessions, "is that it makes you question everything you think you know about love and loyalty. Learning to trust your own perceptions again is half the battle." My relationship with Aunt Carolina's memory became a source of strength and guidance. I established a scholarship fund in her name for young people who had been abandoned or rejected by their families, but were working to build better lives despite those challenges. The fund grew rapidly as news of my story spread, with donations coming from people across the country who had experienced similar betrayals. The first scholarship recipient was Maria Santos, a 17-year-old whose parents had kicked her out for refusing to participate in their insurance fraud scheme. Her story reminded me of my own experience, and being able to provide her with resources for college felt like honoring Aunt Carolina's legacy while preventing another young person from facing the isolation I had endured. "You saved my life," Maria told me when I presented her with the scholarship check. "Not just the money, but knowing that someone who went through something similar could build a successful life. It gave me hope that I could survive this too." The media attention from my story led to speaking opportunities across the country. I began giving talks about family dynamics, criminal enablement, and the importance of questioning narratives that seem designed to protect certain people while sacrificing others. Universities, law enforcement agencies, and victim advocacy groups invited me to share my experience and the lessons learned from my investigation. During one presentation at Northwestern University, my alma mater, a student asked me whether I regretted exposing my family's crimes, knowing that it had destroyed any possibility of reconciliation. "Reconciliation was never possible with people who were actively engaged in criminal behavior," I replied. "Real family relationships are built on honesty, trust, and mutual respect. What my parents and brother offered me was conditional acceptance based on my willingness to take blame for crimes I didn't commit. That's not family. That's manipulation." The question prompted me to reflect on what family actually meant to me now. The chosen family I had built, Aunt Carolina, Rachel, Jennifer, the members of our support group, and the network of friends and colleagues who had supported my journey represented everything that my biological family should have been, but never was. As I prepared to leave my childhood home for the final time, I took one last look around the bedroom that had once been my sanctuary and later my prison. The walls that had once held posters and photos and dreams now stood bare, waiting for federal agents to seal the room as evidence. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I was taking with me the knowledge that truth has power, that justice is possible even after decades of injustice, and that the families we choose can be stronger and more loving than the ones we're born into. Standing in that doorway, I finally felt free from the weight of their betrayal and guilt they had forced me to carry. The scared 16-year-old girl who had been thrown away like garbage had become a woman capable of bringing down a criminal empire and helping other victims find their own paths to justice and healing. What strikes me most about family karma is how it often comes full circle in ways we never expect. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone who wronged you finally faced consequences for their actions? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below about how justice eventually found its way to people who thought they could escape accountability. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice served and truth revealed. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes the people who throw us away end up destroying themselves, and that building a life from the ashes of betrayal is the sweetest revenge of all. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember that your worth isn't determined by the people who failed to see it. Sometimes the family that rejects us is doing us the biggest favor of all by forcing us to become stronger than we ever imagined possible. Until next time, keep fighting for your truth, and never let anyone convince you that you deserve less than honesty and respect.